Stories of an Aircraft Builder. In the last few episodes of Stories of an Aircraft Builder, you've seen some of the local newspaper reports at the time about my first reproduction triplane. The following is an article I wrote many years ago, telling the story from my point of view. The story of my very first triplane. Written by myself, Achim Engels. A childhood dream grows 3 wings. Ever since I can remember, aircraft have been the main focus in my life. If asked for a reason, I cannot provide a sufficient answer to it. It just was like it. At the age of 12, I pursued my father to take me and my best buddy Wolfgang Schuster to the Deutsches Museum at Munich. I was fascinated by the reproduction triplane, all painted red, that hung from the ceiling there. So deep was the impression that I told my dad that I was going to build one myself. He tapped the little youngster's head and said, "Sure you will," which did not sound convinced at all. Anyway, I wanted to build it, so I started collecting documentation about how it was designed. And there it was, the growing understanding that no one really knows. The information found was contradicting and ranged from obviously wrong to close to what it actually looked like back then. The people I came into acquaintance with about it differed from being very helpful and sharing to "I show off what I have, but you ain't getting anything from me." It was a lesson learned that things just a few decades ago are lost, and sketches of the past created a not so accurate image of the truth. This holds true for events that happened as well as for design features of an admittedly technically thing many talk of. The Fokker triplane, the famous mount of a famous historical figure, Manfred Freiherr von Richthofen. There was I, young, untrained, with just a dream. No money, no idea, no plan. So I started to develop a copy of the Fokker triplane in 1/6 scale with the intention of making it a radio-controlled model that should be built as close to the original as possible for me. After finishing the fuselage of the model in 1/6 scale, I decided to go for full size, which could not be much more difficult, just bigger. On the full-size aircraft, I started with the wings, however. But how could I start with no location and no money? So I sat down and wrote letters to all museums I could reach in Europe, asking if they would be interested in a Fokker triplane reproduction. It was only one museum that said yes. That was the Technik Museum at Speyer on the Rhine. They agreed to pay 5,000 marks in steps until the project should be finished. And so I began my first triplane at the age of 16. And here is its story. It was nothing but pure luck that I fell in love with that little Fokker triplane. During construction of the wing ribs, I realized soon that the triplane provided a very big advantage compared to other aircraft. All 3 wings carried the same airfoil, and there was no tapering of the wings at all along the whole wingspan. In fact, that meant that I only needed to construct one masterpiece as a template. Since about 60 almost identical ribs were needed, this circumstance was appreciated very much. The outer shape of the airfoil was transferred to large-size plates of plywood. These sheets have been produced of finished birch aircraft plywood, and the dimensions have been 1.5 meters times 1.5 meters. The ribs have been drawn onto the sheets in a way that allowed to use most of the material. One of these large plywood sheets with the ribs drawn onto was laid upon 2 other sheets that have been left blank. The whole thing was secured against slipping away by clamps. Then I used a pad saw to cut out the raw ribs. These ribs have been collected in groups of 10 and were cut together to final shape, and at least also got sanded. The result was the base work pieces for the further construction of the ribs, the so-called rib webs. To be honest, the very first ribs were cut each one by one using a carpet cutter. This was very exhaustive and time-consuming, so this more reliable method was adopted. It makes me smile today to see how I approached the making of the first plane. Eventually I learned so much about aircraft building that I do things much more efficient today. But as we say in Germany, es ist noch kein Meister vom Himmel gefallen. No master just falls from the sky. The next thing I had to do was the finishing of the rib cap strips from strips of 9 by 6 mm of fur. On their 9 mm wide side, the strips got a 3 mm deep groove. The width of the groove was wide enough to let the plywood rib webs go in. These cap strips have been pushed onto the outer edges of the rib webs to form cap strips. After that, the lightning holes of each single rib have been cut out using a hole saw. What was still missing was the strengthening strips of the plywood glued to the sides of the rib webs, as well as the cutout for the main wing spar and the rear spar. By then the ribs were finished as raw pieces. I then threw my attention to the production of the wing spars of the aircraft. Each spar consists of 4 flanges made from spruce. The thickness of these flanges does not change through the whole wingspan, while their width tapers towards the wingtip. 2 of these flanges have been put together by means of plywood sheets to form a box spar. At first, one of these plywood covers was nailed and glued to the flanges. At the locations where the wing fittings had to be, special filling pieces of wood have been glued into the box spar before it was closed on the other side. These filler pieces prevented the sheets of plywood from being pressed together by the force of the screws to secure the fittings and distribute the loads applied to the screws into the box structure. Following this box spar was closed by the second sheet plywood on the opposite side. 2 of these box spars have been put together again using plywood sheets on top and bottom to achieve a single box type wing spar without the dimensions of 100 mm by 200 mm. During this procedure also only one side was closed while the other side was left open. In regular distances there have been glued special bulkheads inside to the wing spar to prevent it from being twisted by the forces in the air. The design of all 3 main spars was the same. The only difference lay in the wingspan and the design of the fittings. All 3 wings have thus been constructed in the back room of my father's electronics shop in Schorndorf. There we established some kind of a little workshop. Of course, the conditions at least have been some kind of weird, but it did work. The wing spars themselves have not been very long, but not that cumbersome. This changed in the moment I started to pull the ribs onto them. The depth of the wing is 1 meter, a tiny aircraft. The lower wing was the first to be done. The ribs have been pulled onto and the small supporting spar at the end of the wing was pulled in. The connection between the ribs and the main wing spar was provided by simple triangular pieces of spruce that have been tacked and glued to both sides of the rib ply on the spar. At the sides of the rib web, these pieces covered the full depth between the upper and lower rib flanges. At the top and bottom side of the spar and at the underside, these triangular spruce pieces were only 40 mm long and have been located at the back side of the wing spar only. The structure of all 3 wings is the same. After the lower wing was finished as a raw piece and all upcoming problems have been settled, it was relatively easy to assemble the remaining 2 wings. What still provided difficulties to me was the lack of space available within our small workshop. To proceed with the assembly of the middle and the upper wing, we had to find a place to store the lower wing in the meantime. It was considered the best to hang it from the ceiling to get it out of the way. I did the same with the middle wing when completed. Only while assembling the upper wing, further minor difficulties arose up. The wingspan of more than 7 meters. Now we had to use the full diagonal line of the room to get the wing finished. Step by step, the wings of one of the most famous fighter aircraft of the First World War grew up in the back room of my father's electronics shop. It was for sure somehow some kind of a magnificent feeling to see something old grow up new. The euphoria became bigger and bigger with every single part that was added to the project. Slowly but steady, below our hands, an aircraft was put together. The dream that raced within my young heart some years ago now in the truest sense of the word got wings. At last the nose covering of plywood had to be pulled onto the wing ribs. With this the wings nearly have been finished. All over Schorndorf I could not find a reliable garage or small workshop where I could carry on with the work. The only room that I found was a part of an old barn I rented eventually at 150 German marks per month. This room within the barn was an open space and was located some 5 meters above the floor level with a space of 7.5 by 4 meters. Worst of all, in the center of this place was a big hole measuring 2 by 2 meters, for an old not working elevator was situated there. The only securing from falling down was provided by a fence of simple wood boards. There I now had to put the wings, since they hindered the work in the workshop, by their size, immensely. Through a window in the back of my father's shop, the wings were brought out one by one. Following this, they have been put onto the rooftop of an old Ford Fiesta. With walking speed, we carried them the way to the barn, which was 3 miles away in town. Carefully, we brought them upstairs, where they awaited their covering with linen fabric. Meanwhile, the work proceeded at the workshop. Since the triplane used in large number steel tubing construction that was welded, I now had to familiarize with that kind of work. Again, the clever books have been consulted. But there is a long way from theory to earning practical useful skills. Of course, my first welding trials could rather more be compared with the work of roasting jack than with good welded seams, but I managed to handle it eventually. The first part I dared to construct was the triplane's rudder. Work went well ahead, and the result was a beautiful comma-shaped rudder, a motivation piece. Shortly afterwards, the ailerons followed, then the stabilizer and the elevator. These parts also have been stored away in the barn. Now heavy work was to be done, since the steel tubings of the fuselage structure had to fit exactly one to another to allow a good welding result. To achieve this, I used simple rasps and files and worked on each tube by hand until it did fit. The welding job was done in a jig, which was a simple self-made wooden construction to hold all the tubes in place. A regular heating of the tubes within the structure is important, since the whole structure would otherwise get twisted due to uneven heating. The working on the fuselage frame was carried out in the garage of Wolfgang Schuster's home. The whole fuselage frame was covered by a protective coating, followed by olive green color after the welding was done. This again happened at the barn, together with all other steel tubing components that have been finished earlier. At all the locations where later the fabric covering should be fixed, the tubes have been wrapped by 30 mm wide strips of linen fabric. To this wrapping later the covering could be glued and sewed. Meanwhile, the space available at the barn was almost filled up by aircraft components. One could hardly turn around anymore. It also was a constant back and forth between my father's electronics shop, Wolfgang Schuster's garage and cellar, and the barn. The covering procedure was a first for me and was tried by using small self-built wooden frames, and after this went well I started to cover the smaller surfaces such as rudder, elevator and ailerons. All covering works have been carried out inside of Wolfgang Schuster's garage again. Garage days. Following these smaller parts, I also brought the lower wing to the garage and started covering it. This also went well without any problems. The most time-consuming process while covering was the stitching of the fabric onto the ribs. To allow the fabric to be stitched to the ribs, they have first been covered with fabric that was laid upon the flanges and glued to the rib webs. Unfortunately, we have not been able to cover the middle and the lower wing in the garage too. The garage was simply not long enough. Already while covering the lower wing, no single sheet of paper fitted between the wingtip and the closed door. For this reason, I covered them at the barn. The fuselage again was covered inside the garage. Now we proceeded with the construction of the landing gear. There have been difficulties with the acquiring of the streamlined tubings needed to go ahead. The material came from the US, since there was no company found that produces such tubes here in Germany. I did not want to make it myself at the time, nor did I know at the time how to do it. It would have been possible, but also rather complicated. The wheels turned up from alone. Within the barn, where the aircraft parts have been stored, we found an old fire car, a trailer. Its wheels have been exactly the same shape we needed. Diameter, dimensions, numbers of spokes, shapes, everything was a perfect match. The only misfortune was the profile on the tires. There they stood now, really finished, all the single construction units of my first reconstructed and hand-built aircraft, the Fokker Dr.I, or Engels E1, as I call it since it is not built by Fokker, but just a copy. The date of finishing and the time of being shipped to the museum at Speyer also approached unstoppable. Up to this point, I simply had to hope that all parts would fit together, since we worked according to my own drawings. For this reason, we decided to assemble the aircraft at least one time for a final testing. Following some considerations, we decided to build the aircraft up in the backyard of Wolfgang Schuster's home. The assembling of the aircraft almost went as smooth as the construction itself. For approximately 1 week, the aircraft stood there in the backyard, guarded day and night by us. There, underneath the Mirabellum plum tree. This became important. It is important to mention the Mirabelle tree, and it should not be overlooked, since during the last week several reporters of different newspapers came to review us, and each of these reporters mentioned the Mirabelle tree in his report. All the same kind of school. The aircraft became the sensation of town, and we hardly could finish the work in time given all the interviews requested. But by anything that tried to keep us away from finishing work, we did it right in time and prepared the aircraft for its journey to the museum. The day came, and at one evening also the truck of the museum. With a heavy heart, we brought the plane onto the truck. First the wings, then the stabilizer and rudder, as well as the elevator. At last, the fuselage. It was raining that evening. The truck disappeared, and with it my childhood dream. 2 weeks later we also drove to the museum to assemble the aircraft there. What still was missing was the engine and the propeller. These parts we should deliver as reproduction dummy parts as well. One more time we went to visit to Speyer to make last modifications on the paintings and markings. At the same time we painted all the serial numbers onto the right places. Soon afterwards, the dummy propeller and engine also have been finished and could be installed by us. Those items have supposed to be interim parts only for decoration, since the museum staff wanted to look for a real rotary engine to be put in. As soon as they saw our reproduction engine and dummy propeller, they said it will do as it is, although we told them that the dummy motor would be an optical copy of the 100 horsepower Oberursel U1 and not of the UR2 as used by the triplanes. By now the completely finished Fokker triplane hangs from the ceiling of the museum. I do consider this first static reconstruction of the Fokker triplane as having been the first step into the right direction of providing a basis for discussion. Based on the earned knowledge, I wanted to evaluate errors and mistakes to assure the historical knowledge will be saved for future generations in the correct way. For sure, there have been made mistakes with that plane during the course of reconstruction, but wherever possible, they have been corrected. For sure, my construction drawings were always kept up to date, corrected and improved. I judge my work from the point of view of the experimental historian and in no other way. I am not simply interested in producing reproduction aircraft lookalikes, but am rather more endeavored to base my documents upon historically authentic sources. The triplane featured in this article was my first step, a combination of childhood dream come true and learning experience in all respects, whether historical study, research, handcrafting skills and understanding of aviation's nature, and as a tool and weapon in human conflict, or bringing together people. I am very happy with that first project of mine, which also formed me as human being and laid the path for a future that created almost 20 flying airplanes today that have been made by my hands. Fun it was, educative it was, fun it will be, and I will keep on learning and encouraging others to go for it, if aircraft building and flying is their dream. Only you can do it.